Now, Mr. Speaker, as Conservatives, we have said all along that we want to make sure that we build the homes, we axe the tax, fix the budget, and stop the crime. And this government has no intent on doing any of that. We know that housing in this country is in a desperate situation, that in the 9 years under the Liberal NDP coalition, that the cost of rent has doubled, the cost of mortgages has doubled, and the number of housing starts are below that than what we did back in 1976. We say we want to axe the tax, and this is very important to my riding. I was just meeting with some cattle producers from Manitoba, including from my riding, and they were telling me over and over again that every time they have to pay the carbon tax, every time the carbon tax is hidden in all the supplies that they buy, it's all trickled down, and that means that they are getting less and paying to the government more. And of course, when they go around and sell their cattle, which right now, thankfully, is at record highs, people are complaining about the price of beef on the store shelf. Well, you got to remember that those coolers that those store shelves have their beef on are often generated through thermal electricity or under natural gas. We know that that adds extra costs to that price of beef. We know that in the transportation of that beef from the farm to the packer, from the processor into the retailer, all gets added in, and consumers are paying more, and of course they can't afford it. We're going to fix the budget because this government continues to run up these huge national debts and larger than ever deficits that are actually going to hurt each and every one of us. We know from the Governor of Bank of Canada has said that this has not been helpful in controlling inflation. It has not been helpful in them being able to get down interest rates. And of course, every time that we have a Trudeau as Prime Minister, we pay record high interest rates. My first farm that I bought back in 1984, under the former Trudeau, my interest rates on that mortgage were 21%. Pretty high and pretty impossible almost for a 19-year-old young farmer to get going. And I had to eat that at the bank because of out-of-control spending by that Liberal government from 1980 to 1984. And our young people today are paying that cost because of this out-of-control spending and little care for the economic performance of this country under this Liberal NDP coalition. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we have to stop the crime, and this is something that this government has for 9 years ignored the plight of Canadians who are dealing with increasing criminal activity, including violent crime, which has gone up by over 32% across this country, including in my riding, the Selkirk-Interlake Eastman, including in the city of Winnipeg, where the member from Winnipeg North resides. And we see over and over again repeat offenders generating 90% of the crimes that are being committed against Canadians. We want safer communities, and that's why, as Conservatives, under our leadership of our leader from the PN, that we will do jail, not bail, keep those violent repeat offenders, those that are perpetrating crimes ongoing behind bars, and actually reduce crime across this country. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you know, I am the Shadow Minister for National Defence, and I'm very concerned by the way this government has ignored our Canadian Armed Forces and how we've gone from a proud, honored institution to where they're now again into a decade of darkness, which occurred, of course, under the Chrétien era. We're living that again. I actually have members and veterans of the armed forces telling me that they are actually in a decade of disaster because of the dithering and delays that are being carried out by this government. Well, we know for a fact that the world has gotten much dangerouser. We know that not just because of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, but we are seeing increased saber rattling by the Kremlin with NATO members in the Baltic region, which we just witnessed this past week, with them redrawing boundaries along Estonia and Russia, between Finland, Sweden, and other Baltic nations with Russia. And that type of aggression and provocation by by President Vladimir Putin and his kleptocrats in Moscow continue to undermine our security. We know that Beijing, the communist regime in Beijing, and with their People's Liberation Army, continue to saber rattle with Taiwan. The rhetoric coming out of Beijing this past week after the inauguration of Taiwan's new president was deplorable. We know that their ongoing aggression against the Philippines in the South China Sea and around the East Thomas Shoal continues to undermine security, cooperation, and peace and prosperity within that region. And we know that Japan, South Korea, and other Indo-Pacific countries are more and more concerned about China's growing disturbance in the region. And so we know that the government has failed to make the investments in the Canadian Armed Forces to meet our NATO target, and we know that we have the Washington Summit coming up. And there's been a lot of concern expressed, especially since the defense policy update came out, that there is no plan to meet that NATO target. Now, the Minister of Defense himself has said that the Canadian Armed Forces is in a death spiral. He has said that our equipment is wore out and unsustainable. He said at committee today, the Minister of National Defense said at committee today that our Victoria-class submarines are no longer serviceable. And we know that the greatest proliferation of weapon systems in this country outside of air-breathing missiles, which are hypersonic and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we're seeing with the advancement of more and more cruise missiles and drones, outside of that domain, the next biggest growing proliferation of weapons are submarines. And the best way to defend against a submarine is to have a submarine. And the minister is saying today, essentially, that we no longer have serviceable submarines to defend Canada and our maritime approaches. So we have to make sure that we're standing up for our troops. And the minister said that we're short 6,700 housing units. We hear stories of our members of the Canadian Armed Forces living rough. They're living in cars, they're living in tents, they're living in campers, they're couch surfing in places like Halifax, in Esquimalt, and in Toronto. We know that they need to have proper housing, Mr. Speaker, and we can't recruit because this government under the NDP-Liberal coalition has not put the troops first and foremost in their mind, making sure they get the kit. Now, they will talk that they gave a recent raise, but by giving that raise, they also increased the rent of military housing. We actually passed a motion here just 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, calling on the government to reverse that decision. And, of course, the Minister of National Defence and the Liberals voted against it. This has affected our recruitment capabilities, and that's why we're still short 16,000 troops. We know that readiness continues to be undermined. And all of us remember General Andrew Leslie, who is a former Army commander and also was the whip for the Liberals for some time, has come out and stated that I'm not aware of any other NATO army which will be deploying troops to the front line of a possible confrontation with Russia who are not 100% trained according to a variety of battle test standards. He's saying that the defense policy update and the most recent budget by the Liberals and the main estimates that we're dealing with at that committee has undermined our overall readiness, where we're now only 61% standing ready. We are not training our troops like we're supposed to be before we deploy to places like Latvia at CFB Wainwright in Alberta. We are no longer doing fighter pilot training in this country. We have farmed that out to places like the United States and Italy. And so we aren't having that base training here, and our current fleet of fighter jets do not even have enough pilots to fly them in the Canadian Air Force. So, Mr. Speaker, I would just say that based upon the comments that we heard just this past week from multiple U.S. senators, from the ambassador, they're saying that Canada is an outlier in NATO. 18% of the countries will meet the 2%. 13% have a plan to get to 2% within the next couple of years. Canada's the only country that will never make it, and that's because we have a Prime Minister who actually said that we will never be at 2%.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if the member could tell me and reflect in terms of his comments. He said that we haven't used military land to build houses. There's a thing called Campion Barracks in the city of Winnipeg. He might want to reflect on that. That was military land. He talks about a government that's not investing in housing. That's mind-blowing in terms of to the degree in which we've invested in housing. And he said that we don't work with other governments. I can't believe the member said that. We have so many announcements with municipalities and provinces. Like, where's he been sleeping? Like, it's incredible amount of work and cooperation we're getting from the different levels of government. Why should Canadians believe what the member is saying if he's so factually incorrect in a very short answer?
The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, first of all, I'm glad to see Campion Barracks under the control of Treaty 1 because I know they will get the houses built as a First Nation and not have to deal. They'll be doing it on their own without any assistance from this federal government, and they can do it under their own rules and regulations and build the homes. And that's what we're seeing right across this country, including in places like Vancouver, because this government continues to reward gatekeepers rather than get them all the way. Out of all the announcements done, man, they make great announcements. They haven't built one single home. Except I actually took one of their announcements. I built a really nice paper home, and that's about the only home that they've been able to build, thanks to my hard work and their piece of paper.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Edmonton West.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I'm glad he brought up the issue around crime. Last month was the tragic one-year anniversary of a young mother and her young child being murdered on streets of Edmonton by a man who had just been released on bail after assaulting a young girl and another person, out on parole after stabbing someone randomly and charged with attempted murder, out on parole after also trying to stab someone to death, while also out on bail on 4 different violent assault charges. Wow. I'm wondering, we saw the Liberals introducing C5, C75 soft on crime bills. I wonder if the member could perhaps give some feedback why he thinks this Liberal government is prioritizing the rights of criminals instead of innocent victims.
Good question.
The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, first and foremost, I just have to express my sympathies to the family that lost their loved one in that murder. This government has never put victims first. They always have stood up for the criminal and are trying to reduce the number of incarcerations, which we know that those that work in Corrections Canada do great work and making sure that we are kept safe and that those that are incarcerated are getting the support and help they need to reintegrate back into society when they have served their sentences. But this government continues to do bail instead of jail, and Mr. Speaker, that has undermined our country. It's made us more unsafe, and our communities are being terrorized by repeat violent offenders that this Liberal NDP coalition continues to put on our streets instead of behind bars.